morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm Keith Brooks from the Education Department. We're here as a part of the faculty development team. Welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime at the BU Library is a collaboration with different offices on campus with the Friends of the BU Library with the mission to encourage lifelong learning beyond the classroom for faculty, students, and staff. In fact, be thinking of how you can share your research and projects in the fall. So most likely I will be emailing you all, trying to get some ideas of what you all might be thinking about presenting in the fall. And for any students who are here, as you complete your research paper this spring, consider submitting for the $250 library research project. That's a pretty big deal. The deadline is February 15th, 2012. But today, Chris Gehrz will close out our season with a Not Ready for Primetime presentation called, as you see here, In Search of a Useable Past, Pietism and the Historiography of Christian Colleges and Universities. Let's welcome this.
Well, thank you for coming. First of all, I want to thank the Convocation Committee for scheduling a talk on climate change at exactly the same time as this talk. It leads to a more pietistic, small group, conventicle type setting. I think it's nice. Feel the warmth of fellowship. It's not a big crowd or anything. Now, some of you might be here because you'd rather dodge the very contentious, controversial climate change topic. I would suggest that you're going to hear two much more controversial arguments here today than anything about global warming. Number one, the pietism actually can sustain an educational project, which seems like lunacy to a lot of people. And second, that the past matters to the present, which, I'm a historian, so I'm biased, but I think that's what happened 4 and 40 and 400 years ago might actually affect what we do 4, 40, and 400 years from now. So today I'm talking about this idea of the usable past. And to get started, let me take you back 55 years ago this spring to what's going to sound like a similar occasion. A Bethel history professor of Swedish descent was giving a talk to his colleagues, and his topic was the history of pietism and its influence on education at Bethel. The scripture says there's nothing new under the sun. And that we'll talk more about that professor. His name was Delphi Fagerström. It's a great name. We need to hire more Delphis and Fagerströms at Bethel, I'd say. He proclaimed himself in search of usable elements from the history of European pietism. And here he's evoking what the literary critic Van Wyck Brooks had called the usable past. And I have this new device, so even though I'm standing right by my computer, I'm going to use this. I'm just that lazy. Brooks was not a historian, but he characterized the discoverable past as being no less inspiring than one imagined by the novelist or the poet. Quote, "The past is an inexhaustible storehouse of apt attitudes and adaptable ideals. It opens of itself at the touch of desire. It yields up now this treasure, now that, to anyone who comes to it armed with a capacity for personal choices. And this spirit has inspired some Christian colleges and universities to retrieve usable elements of their traditions rather than reject the past as irrelevant to their fast-changing circumstances." Several of these schools are featured in a 1997 book called Models for Christian Higher Education, edited by Richard Hughes and William Adrian, then of Pepperdine University. It looks at how colleges and universities from different Christian traditions adapted past ideals, these apt attitudes, to define their presence and shape their futures. And here's the list of the traditions and the colleges covered in that. And each tradition had a kind of explanatory, more general essay from someone within that tradition. Notice here, this is a wide-ranging collection, from Roman Catholic and Lutheran to Reformed, interdenominational evangelical, Restorationist, which gets us to Pepperdine. There's a significant absence here that Fagerström would be upset about, which is that there's no pietist tradition, of course, included in the list. And that's a significant choice on the editor's part, especially considering that pietism is, the words of theologian Roger Olson, North America's grassroots form of religion. Even if you leave out the many Protestant churches that have been a clear but indirect influence of pietism, think here especially of Wesleyan churches, a surprising number of American churches perch at least part-time on the pietist branch of the Christian family tree. That include the Moravian Church, at least half a dozen different brethren groups, a German Reformed Synod that's now part of the UCC, several different Scandinavian Lutheran synods, 2 of which came together back in the 1880s to form my church, the Evangelical Covenant Church, which later, part of which split off and became the Evangelical Free Church, and Swedish and German Baptist conferences, and there are probably others that I didn't include here. But it's a pretty long list, and all of these churches founded institutions of higher learning. Here's just a partial selection from this part of the country of some, I guess, pietist colleges from these various churches. It's not an exhaustive list in any way. I'll talk about several of these. While he didn't see fit to include their stories in his collections, if Hughes is correct, these colleges, universities, and seminaries ought not to neglect their pietist past. Pointing out the Catholic, Lutheran, and Mennonite institutions are shaped by those traditions, Hughes contends, quote, to the extent that these institutions seek to structure their work around a Christian mission at all, they inevitably must draw upon their historic Christian identities or church connections. You cannot ignore your past, or you can, but you do it at great peril to your mission and identity. And so we should ask, is the same not true for institutions that have pietists' roots? Can they ignore their pietist past? So in this paper, I want to consider first why the pietist past may seem to have less utility than others for Christian higher education. But I also want to give examples of those like Delphi Fagerström who found it eminently usable, especially in the history of this place and the Covenant School in Chicago, North Park. First of all, definitions. Pietism scholars spend endless pages disputing just what they're studying. So for the purposes of this talk, I want to give a definition and keep it short. To give the two ends of the spectrum, most narrowly, strict constructionists, so-called, label as pietists only those members of a certain party by that name within German Protestant churches in the 17th and 18th century. And then more broadly, there are those who see pietism as a kind of experiential religiosity that transcends time and space, and it's not necessarily Protestant or even Christian, even atheist pietism, if you push it far enough. As you might expect from a Covenanter, I'll take a middle position and say that pietism here is going to include any movement within Christianity whose historiography acknowledges a significant debt to the German pietists, but like them, emphasizes things like personal experience of conversion, regeneration, the inner versus the outer person, recentering Scripture over doctrine as the source of Christian authority, views devotional practices, individual and small group, as essential to Christian life, and holds an expansive view of Christian freedom. And I'd also add that even the many quietistic pietists believe that conversion leads to love for neighbor, and therefore social concern, from Franke's ministries of compassion and mercy to the radical pietist embrace of justice activism. So, with pietism lessly defined, why might it not provide the most usable of paths for Christian higher education? And I want to illustrate two impediments, possibly. And here we'll draw upon four churches you might not be that familiar with that come from very different places in the family tree. They're all from the interaction between pietists and Anabaptists, and so they're all brethren of a certain kind. So we'll talk about the Church of the Brethren, the COB. Starts in the early 18th century in Schwarzenau, Germany, as a radical pietist sect that adopts Anabaptist ecclesiology and baptismal practice, and eventually moves across the Atlantic and settles in places like Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and other British colonies. I also want to talk about the Brethren in Christ, and probably not time permitting, United Brethren, which now have become part of the UMC in most respects. Both began life later in the 18th century as Anabaptist groups that came under German pietist influence and then split from the Mennonites because they emphasized personal conversion and emotional experience too much for Mennonite tastes. And then finally, the MBs, the Mennonite Brethren, which started life later in the 19th century in Russian, German-speaking Mennonite colonies, but came under pietist and Anglo-American evangelical influence and split off. We'll talk about that historiography. Eventually, they moved to places in Canada, in the United States, including Kansas, where they set up Tabor College, and California, where they set up their flagship institution, which is now Fresno Pacific University. I'll have more to say about that. Despite the catalytic role of pietism that left these denominations as somewhat unique entities, distinct from both the Protestant and Anabaptist mainstreams, their historians and educators have rarely found pietism to have enduring value. And here I want to acknowledge my research assistant from a year or two back, Taylor Furta, who did much to help teach me about these four traditions. So this owes a lot to former Bethel Research Prize winner, Taylor Furta. First, it's hard, this is the first impediment, it's hard to disentangle pietism from other influences that shape these denominations. Pietism has always been a renewal movement. It's instinctively ecumenical, and it's rarely separatistic. The classical pietist ambition is to cultivate little churches within churches, not to set up freestanding ecclesiastical structures. So the pietist is usually participating in conversation, not delivering a monologue. So it's hard to disentangle pietism from, say, Anabaptism. So one historiographical response is to say it's impossible to disentangle them, and you shouldn't even try. For example, in the Hughes and Adrian collection, there's an essay about the history of Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, written by religious historian Douglas Jacobson. Messiah starts life in 1909 to train missionaries and pastors for the Brethren in Christ. Like most of the schools I'll talk about, it started life as a seminary and then became a college or university later. Jacobson acknowledges the crucial role that Pietists played in the life of the BIC, which started as an Anabaptist group, then adopted Pietism, and then later in the 19th century became actually more Wesleyan in character. And those three have formed a kind of distinctive synthesis that Jacobson claims for Messiah. But he identifies no distinctively pietistic contribution. He simply says this is part of the story, but really at most just part of the origin. He doesn't pull out that thread. So in studying this hybrid identity, he chooses to name and honor each of the threads without unraveling them. By contrast, Paul Tays and other scholars in the Mennonite Brethren Church have sought to recover an Anabaptist past at the expense of a Pietist past. In the 1960s, a group of such professors at the MB Flagship School, what became Fresno Pacific, drafted the so-called Fresno Pacific College idea in 1966. It drew on the history of the larger Anabaptist tradition to transform what had been a fundamentalist Bible school, the Pacific Bible Institute, strongly colored by very legalistic pietism, into a Christian liberal arts college that, in the words of the idea statement, aspired to be communitarian, experimental, non-sectarian, and prophetic. Writing the story for the Hughes-Adrian collection, FP historian Paul Tays knows that these neo-Anabaptist professors were inspired by a 1944 speech from a Goshen College historian named Harold Bender called The Anabaptist Vision, which, quote, articulated a usable past, there's that phrase again, that could also become a means for defining the present and shaping the future. So there's an example outside of Pietism, drawing on your tradition to mark a kind of a sea change, to turn away from fundamentalist Bible school towards a kind of neo-Anabaptist liberal arts vision. And to appreciate the historiographical moves that Tays makes here, it's important to recognize he's also a proponent of a fundamental shift in the history of his church. The first and second generations of Mennonite Brethren scholars in North America assumed that their movement had started because German Pietism reinvigorated moribund Mennonite communities. And they actually saw themselves as having split from the Anabaptist mainstream. Against them, Paul Tays promotes the model first proposed in the 1970s by John Tays. I don't know if they're relations, but I assume so, which minimizes the role of Pietism and stresses continuity with Anabaptists and Mennonites. And significant maybe that this is the first new building when FP moved to its new campus in Fresno, and it was called in the 1970s Sattler Hall after the Anabaptist martyr Michael Sattler, who dies in the late 1520s, and symbol of this Anabaptist renewal. Something of the same response can be found in the historiography of the Church of the Brethren, the COB, which founded many colleges, including probably its flagship, Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. You get kind of the same emphasis on Anabaptism to the exclusion of Pietism, but I would say there are also several Brethren scholars, especially Donald Dernbaugh and Dale Brown, who refused to make that choice. In fact, here you're seeing the Young Center at Elizabethtown, which is the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. So there's a refusal to set the two against each other. And a few years back, in 2004, another Brethren scholar, Don Miller, who's the former general secretary of that church and a former professor at Manchester College and Bethany Seminary, wrote an article about Brethren distinctives. What's different about the COB higher education? He proposed 9 distinctives. And for most of them, he tied it back to a certain historic tradition. I'll just give you the list you can look at. Some of them he didn't make an explicit, usable past connection, but they seem kind of Anabaptist. For example, reconciliation, justice, and nonviolence. I think he would probably articulate as having Anabaptist roots. 6 of them he explicitly identified as being Anabaptist, but of those 6, 4 he also identified as being Pietist. Let me talk about those 4. First of all, he finds a Pietist commitment to such virtues, this is under religion of the heart, such virtues as truth, love, truthfulness, joy, integrity, fidelity, kindness, gentleness, self-control, gratitude, hospitality, willingness to work, and willingness to learn. The Pietism would lead one to cultivate a life of virtue, in his mind. It's essential not only to a philosophy of education, but to sustaining life together at places like Manchester and Bethany. Second, he argues that the radical Pietist commitment to study afresh biblical text and the history of the church continues to inspire an openness to new evidence and new understandings. Third, he finds that the Brethren emphasis on education preparing students for lives of service has both Anabaptist and Pietist roots. And here he has in mind, speaking about service of a prophet, the charitable institutions of Holland founded by A.H. Franke in the 18th century. For example, orphanages, schools, hospitals, pharmacies, things like that. And then finally, Miller appeals to Holland's historic rival, Herrnhut, in tracing Brethren interests in ecumenism and commitment to the global community back to Zinzendorf and the Moravian Church. So his article represents a rare attempt to mine Anabaptist and Pietist history for usable past and to name which is relatively unusual. The second impediment, if you were an educator wanting to find a usable past in Pietism, is the tradition has a pretty undeniable tendency towards anti-intellectualism. We'll get into that. As an extreme example, back to the history of the Brethren. In 1831 and again in 1857, the annual meeting of what then was called the German Baptist Brethren prohibited their people from attending colleges. So a recurring theme in the history of the Brethren, because they viewed college education as an especially prideful way of conforming to the pattern of the world. So shame on all of you for this. Here's the example of one of their radical Pietist forebears, Gottfried Arnold, the radical Pietist theologian and especially church historian, who abandoned his professorship at the University of Gießen, which as faculty we have a hard time imagining doing that, but he said that he found it impossible to be a real Christian in such a secular and pagan atmosphere. University education corrupted youths and led to vanity. Sorry. Eric, Kirsten, Taylor, I'm sorry for that. When more progressive members of the movement founded Ashland College in 1878, it provoked a schism that led to the multiple Brethren churches that exist to this day. So Elizabethtown was a belated response by the conservatives to found a college. Here I could also talk about the United Brethren, most of whom eventually joined the United Methodist Church. Some of them founded Huntingdon University in Indiana. There's an interesting article, if you want to see the whole paper, you can read it, by a Methodist scholar, Michael Cartwright, at the University of Indianapolis, which was founded originally by the United Brethren, which he talks about the difficulties of pietists in founding institutions of education, because there's this classic tension in pietism between being a religion of the heart and then also being people with a life of the mind. And it seems like focusing too much on the mind is to the detriment of cultivating feelings and a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. This head-heart tension is common to the historiography of many American pietists, including Scandinavian American immigrants like the Norwegian Lutherans, Swedish Mission Covenanters, and Swedish Baptists, who founded respectively Augsburg College, North Park University, and Bethel University. And it's the historiographies of the latter two, North Park and Bethel, I think we can finally find an argument for a usable past of pietism, and definitely not in the history of the Minneapolis school. So we can start with North Park University, although actually we'll start with Augsburg. Any history of North Park begins with its founder and longtime president, David Nybel. And here's his picture. We'll come back to the quotation. To understand why Nybel is so important to Covenanters and to North Park, there's an instructive contrast here with one of his contemporaries, the great initial Augsburg president, George Sverdrup, who was discussed by Augsburg historian Carl Krislak in the centenary Augsburg history called From Fjord to Freeway. And he talks about the long tension between Augsburg, which was founded by pietistic Norwegian Lutherans, and St. Olaf, which was very much non-pietistic and suspicious of pietism and dedicated to humanistic advanced higher education. And we can go into more depth in that. But about Sverdrup here, Krislak, while acknowledging that Sverdrup, like Nybel, had an admirable command of the tools of scholarship, who nonetheless rejected European elitism. Krislak fears that Sverdrup's assault on prevailing systems of higher education left the impression that a narrow anti-intellectualism dominated Augsburg's academic policy. As a result, while their humanistic rivals, so-called at St. Olaf, got this reputation for being a terrific school, Augsburg had a hard time shaking the perception that their program substituted piety for scholarship, which is a common criticism you hear about pietist schools. They're so concerned with cultivating devotional practices, a warm-hearted relationship, they do it at the expense of hard-headed, critical scholarship. And that's a tension that we continue to inhabit at Bethel. Meanwhile, and here's the contrast, Covenant historian Scott Erickson lauds David Nybel for standing up to those in the Mission Covenant who wanted North Park to be what he called a simple preacher's college, or a simple Bible college. And here, picture of North Park. This is the seminary, which inhabits Nybel Hall. One of the many nods to Nybel you'll see if you go to Foster Avenue and visit North Park. So quoting Erickson here, first. Nybel insisted a strong general education program rooted in the liberal arts went hand in hand with traditional pietist concerns. Writes Erickson, Nybel worked hard to calm the fears of Covenanters who were anxious that knowledge and reason found too strong of an emphasis at the expense of faith, simple gospel preaching, or conversion as the one thing needful. He argued strongly that the Christian was capable of interpreting faith while also stressing concerns of intellectual development. And the key speech in Nybel's career came in 1901, which is the 10th anniversary of North Park Seminary and the beginning of North Park as a junior college, and after World War II, like Bethel, it became a 4-year college. And here, in his defining speech, he gives some rather grandiose ambitions that reveal, again, his refusal to say that intellectual achievement and Christian piety butt heads. To see this, our beloved school, the university of the world, to hear in these halls the echo of applause from every quarter of the globe for thoughts nobly thought, for words nobly spoken, and for arts nobly executed. And this would be very small satisfaction to my great ambition. And this is, I think, grandiose, considering this is a small Swedish seminary that no one has ever heard of. But he sees it eventually, this is the seed that will eventually grow into a great university. But at the same time, to plant here, and here see growing and develop to full strength and power, an institution which may deserve to bear the name of a mission school. And the covenant was called the Mission Covenant at this point. A school where the gospel of Christ is the acknowledged standard of culture, fostering a school life whose very pulse is the love of Christ and of all those whom he loves, making the school a center from which radiates to all ends of the world the light of Christ's truth and the warmth of Christ's love and the beauty of Christ's character. I think maybe at Bethel we could hope that one of our forebears would say a similar thing, because there's a similar tension in the Swedish Baptist historiography. For the longtime dean of the North Park History Department, Zenas Hawkinson, the existence of pietists like Nybel belied the tradition's supposed anti-intellectualism. Hawkinson held up Nybel as but one example of what he called the pietist schoolman, in the line of the university-trained educator and philanthropist Franco, I've mentioned before. The pietist schoolman is a type necessarily reflected in Mrs. Hawkinson. The character of pietism is a Christian movement. The pietist schoolman was usually a university graduate, profoundly discontent with the state of the church, determined to see it reformed. He was mainline in theological conviction, but hungry and thirsty for living faith experienced in the company of others. He tended to place less emphasis on creed than on Bible, less on erudition than on pastoral care, less on the authority than on the responsibility of the pastoral office. The pietist schoolman was urgent about his responsibility to the children of common people. Franco loved to say that his duty was twofold, God's glory and neighbor's good. And here he doesn't have the kind of modern idea of the professor in mind, but I think it is intriguing, and I've talked about this elsewhere at Bethel, maybe thinking of professors as having a pastoral role, is to Franco and to Hawkinson, to Nybel, someone with university training, bears pastoral responsibility for their fellow pietists. Hawkinson placed Nybel's student, Carl A. Olson, the Covenant historian and North Park president from 1959 to 1970, and here he as by one spirit, which has been inflicted on Covenant seminarians ever since. In the same line of pietist schoolmen, Olson, according to Hawkinson, chose to grapple with traditional pietist themes from giving his inaugural address in 1959, in which he positioned North Park between church-related colleges that had given into secularization on one hand, and those that withdrew into rigid doctrine and moralism on the other hand. And seeking such a via media is pretty typical of Olson's presidential writings and speeches and his work as a historian of the Covenant. For Olson, the pietist past helped the ECC, the Evangelical Covenant Church, chart a course between the skills and crevices of 20th century Christianity. While Paul Tays and Karl Krislag dismissed pietism as a kind of legalistic anti-intellectual fundamentalism, North Park and Covenant elites typically welcome it as offering an escape from what they see as false choices: secularism and fundamentalism, liberalism and neo-evangelicalism. So to say, the Covenant Church is unique among American denominations in its vocal embrace of pietism. Launching a series of articles in the denominational magazine last March, ECC President Gary Walter declared that, quote, "The Evangelical Covenant Church is what you get when pietists join together to do missions," which is not the typical kind of strategy church leaders in 21st century America are encouraged. Talk about 17th century obscure Germans to label yourself. The same publication then dedicated its July 2010 issue to the theme Pietist at Heart, featuring articles by North Park professors Kurt Peterson and Michelle Clifton Soderstrom. In many ways, then, leading figures in the Covenant and its institutions of higher learning have repeatedly turned to pietism in search of a usable past, struggling neither to define what about the tradition has shaped them, nor at least too much with tension between head and heart. Which makes it all the more striking how little one hears about pietism in North Park today. I think this is less true of the seminary, but certainly at the college, the bulk of the administration and faculty don't seem to find it a relevant heritage. Samuel Schumann, who interviewed administrators, professors, and other community members for a chapter in North Park in his 2010 survey of religious colleges called Seeing the Light, Religious Colleges in 21st Century America, reported no reference whatsoever to pietism. He's coming in as an outsider. His only impression of North Park is interviewing North Park people, and he makes no reference whatsoever to Pietism. I'd like to think they talked to Bethel people. This would show up at least once in a chapter on Bethel. And instead, current president David Parkin stressed to Schumann North Park's ambition to be an urban and multicultural university. Parkin, who spent a quarter century at two other schools with Pietist roots, Messiah and Elizabethtown, before coming to Chicago 5 years ago, seems not to have mentioned Pietism in any of his speeches and reports made as president of North Park. You can do a search because all of his speeches are right there on the website, and you don't find Pietism mentioned. Conversely, J. Barnes, also late of Messiah, has repeatedly listed Pietism among the distinctive influences on himself and Bethel University since becoming its fifth president in 2008. Even as the leaders of this university's founding denomination have demonstrated less and less interest in the Pietist past. If you go to the website for Converge Worldwide, which is the missional name of the BGC, you will find no mention of Pietism even on the history page. That's what I checked it a couple weeks ago. Meanwhile, introducing a forthcoming book that stems from our 2009 research conference on the Pietist impulse in Christianity, J. Barnes asserts this: Pietism shapes the culture and trajectory of Bethel University. And I hope I'm not playing unfair to quote something that I invited, but this was part of the introduction to our book. But I think it's actually accurate. If you look at Jay's statement of faith on the president page at Bethel, you'll find him talk about the importance of pietism. He goes on, after describing how pietism helped form the convictions of those who founded the BGC, to say, those convictions resulted in an approach to education that was centered on devoted life, intellectual engagement with key issues in culture, and discipleship carried out in the community. From founder John Alexis Edgar onward, a Bethel education has been characterized by a devoted heart and a keen mind. Now, to be sure, Pietism is only one of several influences on Bethel and its founding denomination. Here I want to give a shout out to the digital librarians who have put together some really interesting images from Bethel's past. You can find this in a lot of places. I'm not exactly sure if this is 50s or 60s, but this is the old Bethel campus. It's a campus of Christian scholarship. Most obviously, Bethel was founded by Baptists and continues to draw large numbers of students and smaller numbers of faculty from that tradition. Less obviously, in the mid-1950s, Bethel President Carl Lundquist and seminary historian Virgil Olson both stressed the blending of Pietism and Puritanism in Bethel's identity. Olson's summary of this blending echoes Nigel and anticipates Barnes. Quote, with the trained mind, there must be the burning heart. And here I would point out that one of my colleagues, who is by no means a Calvinist, stressed in an essay on Bethel history that John Alexis Edgar was a, quote, moderate Calvinist. Okay, he is awake. But. Third, and to a far greater extent than their Covenant and North Park cousins, BGC and Bethel leaders found themselves at home in the post-World War II neo-evangelical movement, where Covenanters found a lot of tension and the BGC found a home. For example, both Lundquist and his successor, George Brushauer, played leading roles with evangelical flagship institutions like Christianity Today magazine, the Christian College Consortium, and the National Association of Evangelicals, of which Lundquist was president for 2 years in the 70s, and which BGC has joined. The Covenant Church never has. While Olson and Lundquist viewed such partners as congenial to Pietism, Robert Sandin, a Bethel alumnus who later served as Dean of North Park, believed that, quote, American fundamentalism has been at least as determinative in the history of the BGC as Pietism, creating discrepancies that always made it difficult to eliminate confusion and disagreement over the concrete implications of Bethel's traditions. Such discrepancies notwithstanding, as Bethel matured into a 4-year liberal arts college at mid-century, Lundquist and college deans C.E. Carlson, Clifford Larson, and Virgil Olson, late 60s, repeatedly defined Bethel's distinctiveness by reference to what the Covenant president of the time, Theodore Anderson, in a talk at Bethel in 1957, called our pietistic heritage. Again, noting Calvinist influence, Olson still concluded in another article that Pietism was the one word that best encapsulated the heritage and experience of the BGC and its forebears. And Pietist themes recur in Lundquist's writings, especially his annual reports. I won't say more about that except to say, if you're interested, read my article in Christian Scholars Review from earlier this year. But perhaps the most important attempt not only to name the BGC heritage as Pietist, but to analyze how it shaped education at Bethel College came from the aforementioned Delphi Fagerstrom, history professor in the 50s and 60s. In 1956, he gave a talk to his colleagues, which he entitled Thoughts on the Pietist Heritage and the College. Seeking the aforementioned usable elements in European pietism, Fagerstrom identified 4 characteristics most directly relevant to education. First, concern for the spirit rather than the forms of Christianity, and so personal experience over dogma. The expectation that belief would bring about a changed life. Individualism that caused pietists to stress the role of the laity. and an inherent simplicity of belief and demeanor. And from these, he derived two basic themes that he found distinctive of education at Bethel College. First, while Conference Baptists had preserved Orthodox Protestantism, there was a basic anti-authoritarian streak that emphasized the Christian commitment of the individual and the working out of the consequences of that commitment in the maturing total personality of the student. This will be the emphasis rather than an imposition of a detailed blueprint of belief and conduct upon the skins of our students. Among other implications stemming from this anti-authoritarianism, he praised Bethel's embrace of academic freedom and the liberal arts. Like Nybel, Fagerstrom assumed that, quote, a faculty of committed Christians can teach fairly and effectively in the liberal arts, that this can be done coordinately with the Christian instructor's effort to relate arts to the Christian faith. He doesn't see the tension between head and heart that others have seen. He then argued the same impulses in Pietism that produced a high view of spiritual and political freedom also yielded, quote, a more subtle kind of democratic contribution, criticism of the socio-cultural environment. The Pietist example for this lies in their criticism of an institutional Christianity that was closely tied in with the social and political structure. It also lies in their insistence that the Christian life means a new way of walking in contrast to the world. For Bethel College, this meant the courses on the ethical and social dimensions of Christianity loomed large. Concluded Fagerstrom, the role of the man of God as a critic of the world has been asserted from Old Testament times. This role is relevant to any institution of higher learning, but our institution ought to seize the role from an inner compulsion in making a continuing part of our character. Within and from our college, there should be a constant stream of social criticism. And I found this an intriguing picture in the Baptist Pietist Clarion of Fagerstrom with the founder of the political science department at Bethel, Wally Peterson, and Representative then Eugene McCarthy, who of course would later achieve fame in 1968. So he's suggesting that Pietism, its devotional life, should also lead to social criticism, standing apart from the world in its institutions. You can also read this in Carl Lundquist's 1970 report, which is his attempt to sum up Bethel's response to the Vietnam War. He stressed you cannot choose between Pietism and activism. The two should mutually reinforce each other. Again, he rejects the false choice. While appeals like this to the Pietist past can be heard from Bethel leaders throughout the 60s and into the 70s, Sandin, even in 1962, was questioning whether Pietism remained relevant or useful to the faculty or its other constituencies, including churches that supplied students. And then as the effects of the baby boom subsided in the 1970s, Bethel, like North Park and other religious colleges, sought to broaden its base. And historically, the typical move here, if you're a theologically conservative college, was to try to reach a generically evangelical population rather than a regional, ethnic, denominational population. But this came at the expense of minimizing distinctiveness. And that's a big theme in the Hughes-Adrian collection. Paul Tays observes the decline of the neo-Anabaptist idea after 1979. Douglas Jacobson reports that talk of a synthesis, Anabaptist, Pietist, Wesleyan, disappears suddenly in the 1980s because what Messiah was trying to be just another evangelical school. And of course, the same thing happens at Bethel under the leadership of George Brushhopper. And some faculty at the time felt that this was a mistake and urged to return to a usable past of Pietism. In 1985, philosophy professor Stan Anderson asked what continued to set Bethel apart from schools like Wheaton College or Gordon College or Calvin College. And he wondered provocatively, as he's wanted to do, if Bethel College is not distinctively different from other American Christian colleges, then maybe Bethel ought not to exist because we have too many of them. To recover a distinctive identity, he encouraged faculty to study the past to learn who we are and what we have been. We would find more value in conference and Bethel history than most of us think is there. Likewise, history and political science professor and my colleague G.W. Carlson warned a decade later, and several times since, that this Baptist Pietist heritage is one that ought not to be discarded with great ease. The new generic evangelicalism may not be compatible with many of the traditional Pietist Baptist distinctives. I also should mention at least two former Bethel faculty have come back to give talks to faculty on this theme. 1988, Virgil Olson gave one. In 2006, at faculty retreat, Roger Olson came back and said this: told many of my colleagues at Baylor and others about Bethel's distinctive ethos, which is reflected in much of what we do at Truett Seminary, where I teach. No single term describes it adequately, but it clearly is a manifestation of Bethel's and the BGC's Pietist heritage. Here, Christ-centered education begins with the experience of knowing Jesus Christ personally, and that's not just an individual experience, it's a community experience. Jesus Christ and our experience of him, called conversional piety, form the glue that holds everything together. And the text of this talk is still behind the firewall, so Bethel people can get this if you want the link. Okay. As I run out of time, let me offer just a couple of general conclusions, focusing on some suggestions for further research and conversation, I think, here at this place. First, there are reasons of varying legitimacy for the virtual exclusion of pietism from this effort to recover usable pasts in denominational and other traditions. First, some denominations and colleges with pietist roots ignore or minimize them. So it's no surprise that their historians detect little role for pietism in shaping educational visions. Of course, that phenomenon itself is worthy of scholarly interest because it suggests that some pasts aren't usable or that they're treated as discardable. But the historians of those denominations, as well as those like the Covenant Church and the BGC and others more prone to identify with pietism, have largely written for internal audiences and have not sought out or been admitted to larger conversations on these themes. So you can find histories of virtually every college I've described, but almost all of them are published by that college. Most of them are more hagiographical than historical in tone. And very few of them interact in sustained fashion with more general scholarly debates. They're very insular in character. By the same token, the colleges these denominations have produced have not attracted a lot of attention from scholars who either are not Christians or come from other Christian traditions. Perhaps it's because of the small size, relative anonymity, U.S. News rankings, whatever it is. But perhaps it's because, in the case of schools like North Park and Bethel, what pietism values might not be the same thing that other people value. I think here the U.S. News and World Report rankings might value things that a pietist college might not deem as important, whereas what a pietist might value might not be that important to U.S. News. So for those of us at Bethel, I encourage greater attentiveness to the institution's past and roots. That's a big surprise. I know you were all waiting for that. But a critical attentiveness, alert to the tension between head and heart, the difficulties of distinguishing pietism from its partners, and seeking useful comparisons and contrasts, not simply looking to our own past, but looking to others as well. At Bethel itself, I'd first like to hear more discussion of the relationship between pietism and neo-evangelicalism, because as the Covenant teaches us, it's not necessarily a cozy relationship. And second, I find it somewhat surprising how little attention is paid here to the other big descriptor, which is Baptist. There are a lot of Baptist schools that spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a Baptist school. I've never felt that Bethel is one of them. GW might use the phrase Swedish Baptist Pietist heritage, but I think he often treats those second and third words as synonymous with each other or natural complements, and that's not typical to Baptist historiography. There are a lot of very non-pietistic Baptists out there who would reject that. And then there's the first word in the Carlson formula, Swedish. The particular experience of one rather ethnically homogeneous immigrant group has certainly shaped Bethel in important and often good ways. But this might be a place where the past becomes less useful and even a stumbling block to those who might otherwise find pietism agreeable. At North Park, being multicultural seems to have helped push pietism aside. Perhaps this need not be the case, but the desire to draw a more diverse community of faculty, staff, and students may require recasting the distinctive concerns and emphases of pietism in ways that speak to different constituencies with roots outside of early modern Northern Europe and the diasporas that stem from it. As an example of how such connections might be forged, I encourage you to read two of the chapters once the Pietist Impulse book comes out. First, Peter Heltzel's argument that Moravian pietism by way of prophetic African-American religion helped Martin Luther King Jr. develop his notion of the inner church. And second, our colleague Victor Zigbo's piece on pietistic consciousness among the indigenous peoples in present-day Ghana. They found a congenial relationship with Württemberg pietist missionaries in the 19th century. And that's where we'll close. Thank you for your attention. We've got maybe 2 minutes for questions, which is perfect. That way you can't show me how ignorant I am. You can ask one question, we're done. I'd also be happy to send around the full paper. I was skipping around here and there, and if you want to read the footnotes, they're extensive and boring to talk about. Dean Hartless.
I'm just interested in what have you found is the most surprising to you as you look into pietism and its relationship to a university? What's surprising?
Well, it's not hugely relevant to this, but the tension between Anabaptism and pietism I didn't expect at first. And so it's not my main field, but I found it interesting to read the story of the Mennonite Brethren. There was this tension between those who would say it's a pietist movement and those that say Anabaptist. Because, yeah, I think at this place, in some of GW's articles, makes this claim that Bethel is not only Baptist, but it can draw on Anabaptist themes. And think of Fagerstrom's talked about pietists should be innately suspicious of the wider culture and ought to maybe take prophetic stands against it. But it's interesting that at least for some Bethel faculty and some of the BGC, that seems like a congenial fit, that pietist devotion and conversion would lead to, might sound like an Anabaptist prophetic stance. the Mennonite Brethren, that would be rejected out of hand. Pietism there leads to fundamentalism and legalism and quietism, withdrawal from the world, retreat from key issues, and just defining a holy community that has no concern for the world. And that's not the case in the Covenant or mostly in the BGC. And so I find studying that historiography instructive by comparison maybe to our own from that.
In your two main research, particularly of the BGC, it strikes me that the Baptist element is a sort of lowercase b Baptist, or maybe Free Church. And would that be a better way? I mean, in what sense is it Baptist? I mean, how would you mark the difference?
I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of curious to actually delve a little more deeply into this talk, because he actually based this on a talk that Clifford Larson gave. Larson, before becoming dean, was the head of the Christianity department at Bethel, and apparently he'd given a talk where he looked at the University of Halle and gave a talk. But later in the 60s, he actually gives another talk at Bethel that GW has quoted in one of his articles, where he talks about a theme very much like this. At least GW describes this as either Baptist or Anabaptist. And so, I mean, I don't think this has much to do with baptismal practice, but a sense of a free church, which also is part of the covenant heritage. And again, a sense of prophetic stance. I think also that maybe a view of freedom, which I've stressed, maybe other scholars of Pietism wouldn't stress as much. But coming out of the covenant, I think is a very important part of how covenanters understand Pietism, the sense of freedom in a life spent with Christ. And I think also is appropriate to maybe this kind of Baptist tradition.
The key, I think, response is that the reason why the immigrants had to come to the United States was not because they were Pietists, it was because they were Baptists. That was the basis of the persecution in Sweden.
But that's more of a Free Church issue in some sense.
And well, when they brought that with them, then the separation of church and state question, the concept of the church as a voluntary community of baptized believers. The big debate going on even in the conference is the question of, can you have fellowship status for people who aren't baptized? What's the whole function of that? I will argue that converge, I just disagreed to that converge really means that we are now being defined by Campus Crusade rather than by our heritage.
My heritage is Mennonite and a Baptist, and so it's been interesting to me to sort of grow up in Ohio and sort of even run into my own heritage, how the Mennonite Brethren have branched off from. I'm more Swiss Mennonite, so I have a lot of that sort of Eastern influence, but I'm finding the Mennonite influence here is more of the Mennonite Brethren and the more Pietist. And then as I run into Bethel's background with sort of the Swedish Baptist, so it's interesting to me. I'm wondering, what role does sort of the immigration, the time of immigration, and sort of the nature of American development in the Midwest have to do, or geography have to do with sort of the Pietist influence in this area? Because I've been noticing sort of just within the Mennonite Church the differences between here and further east. And sort of those influences. So I wondered if you run into that, or what thoughts you have.
Well, I don't know the Mennonite history well. I mean, I think actually it'd be on the other side of the Atlantic. It's what's happening in Mennonite communities in the 18th century versus the 19th century. My sense, and very flimsy evidence, is that there's a suspicion of Pietism among the mainstream 17th, 18th century Mennonite communities. But there's this Mennonite tendency not to want to flaunt the religiosity. That'd be unseemly, especially as expressed in the Amish. Be prideful in a way. And so Pietism, with all this talk of conversion experiences and personal, warm-hearted relationship and emotional kind of Christianity, that's where the tension, maybe in Europe, and especially in like 18th century colonial America, that's the tension that causes like the Brethren in Christ and the United Brethren to split off from Mennonite communities or to be ostracized from Mennonite communities. I don't know, in the 19th century, there's kind of a sea change then among like these Russian, German-speaking Mennonites to find, that's fine, but it's left us kind of dry. We've got this kind of what we call orthodox, but orthopraxy sort of, here's how we live as Anabaptists, but it's desiccated. And Pietism gives us this new life, and there's that openness then to, in the Mennonite Brethren tradition, that they then bring over in a later wave of immigration to the Midwest and to California and to Canada. So I don't know if it's on the American side so much as on the European side where that's happening. It's an interesting question. And this is, again, why I think it's really important not to have this conversation just in Bethel, but this is part of this interacts with all sorts of other people's experiences as they seek to recover their pasts. And it's a weakness in the scholarship so far. Among people who are studying places like Bethel, and then among people like Richard Hughes, who deem certain traditions well worth study, and then others are on the cutting room floor or just ignore it altogether.
Yeah, I've been struck by the similarities, and I don't know if I would have run into them had I ended up at Bethel. So
Yeah.
it's been really, really interesting.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I've got to go teach class.